Hi, I'm Dan. You found Therapy Woodworks, the funky little wood shop where we sometimes have a lot of fun and we sometimes actually work on wood projects. So this week's project is an interesting one for me. It's interesting because I'm salvaging some wood from a project that I completed 40 years ago, and the project that actually initiated my love for woodworking. The old family table that I built when I was in high school. I was 17 years old. Yeah, do the math. I'm getting pretty old. So I salvaged the table. It had been sitting outside for a while and been a little bit abused. As you can see from some of these pictures, it had warped pretty good and there was dogs chewing on it and various things. So not salvageable as a table, but I'm more than happy to repurpose it and repurpose it for a good cause. The good cause is my wife needs a sit-stand desk. Now my old table was made out of some pretty interesting wood, 8-quarter mahogany, which is, as you know, kind of hard to get these days and kind of expensive. So I'm very glad to repurpose it. The first step in the repurposing process was to get the table into the shop and cut it apart. So the joinery in this was a mortise and tenon style joinery. So I used probably the best tool I could find, my Sawzall, to cut the top off. And then the two ends were cut off by hand, just using a Japanese duku saw, and I could cut the ends off. You can see the mortise and tenon type joinery that remained after I cut the middle spar section off and cut the top off. It's going to offer some interesting challenges. But for this project, I only need the top of the table that I salvaged to make the top for the desk. Now this desk is not going to have any fancy joinery. It really just needs a top. But as you can see, this top from the table that I just cut off is extremely warped. So I'm going to have to cut it into different sections. I'm going to cut it into 8-inch wide sections so it fit on my 8-inch spiral head jointer so that I can joint the boards. I manipulated the top off of the outfeed table / workbench onto the table saw so I could cut them into 8-inch wide sections that I could then take over to the jointer. On the jointer, I faced a face which took actually quite a few passes because some of the boards were significantly warped. We're cutting into the thickness of my tabletop. I don't really like it, but I really have no choice. Once I jointed a face on the jointer, I could then stand them up against the fence on the jointer and joint an edge so that I can re-glue it all back together to make an even flat surface. After I had a flat face and a square edge, a jointed edge, I could relocate my pile of boards from the bandsaw over to the table saw outfeed table. But first I figured I'd cut them up so that I have 3 square edges. So I tripped through the table saw and I had another pile of 4 boards that I could glue back together eventually. Before I could begin the gluing back together process of the boards, I had to get them to the same thickness because they were all varying thickness now, because some of the boards I had to make 3 passes on the jointer, and some of the boards I made 1 pass on the jointer. So I lined them all up, the thickest board on top of the planer, so I'd cut that one first, and then I adjusted down until all of the boards were the same equal thickness. Almost ready for a glue up. Now you remember I had some of those mortise and tenons remaining underneath the panels still. Now I didn't want those to be into the new project, and I had a specific width for the desktop in mind, so I maximized that and marked up all my boards so I could eliminate the old joinery tenons and still have best looking parts of the board I could. So after a quick trip to the miter saw to cut all my boards to the final length that I wanted, I could lay them all out and have a look at it, make sure the joints were all good, and then I could lay out for the dominoes. I'm going to use the 10 by 25 dominoes to keep the tabletop in perfect alignment. All the boards should line up pretty perfectly. I don't have much planing to do. I cut all of my domino holes using my Festool domino hole cutter. I was sure on one edge that I cut the narrow holes that the dominoes would just fit in, and to allow some lateral adjustability in the joint, I cut slightly oversized holes in the other side. I can do that because I'm really primarily concerned with making sure that the thickness of the boards align well, so that it cuts down on the amount of planing and the amount of sanding that I have to do, and the top will be very close to level once I'm done the glue up. Because with this glue up, I can't put my boards back through the jointer or my planer, they're just going to be too wide. So a little bit of finessing with the planer and the sander after the fact are very necessary. During the glue up, I was sure that I filled the cavities, the holes that the dominoes were going into, with glue, set them into place. Hammering them into place makes the glue up much simpler. I did do a dried fit of this glue up before I put the glue on. So once I was sure that everything was ready, I put all of the glue in the holes, tapped the dominoes home, made sure that I had enough glue on the dominoes. Once they were in the holes on the one side of the boards, then I coated all the faces, both the boards with the dominoes in it and the board without the domino in it, so there's plenty glue in the glue up. I could do a final adjustment, a final lateral adjustment of all the boards, just giving them a tap, making sure the ends are all lined up. I am going to do a final trim after, but I want to salvage as much material as I possibly can. So with the lateral adjustment, I could do the final clamps up really good and tight and let her sit for a few days to really thoroughly dry. Once it was dry, I could come back and do the final cleanup. I did some scraping of any excess glue that we had left, and then started the planing process just to finalize that joint. On the bottom side, you'll see that I left some of the original mortise and tenon in there. It's kind of one of those things. It's going to be a signature and a reminder to me when I take the top off in years to come for whatever reason, if we're moving or whatever the reason may be, that, oh yeah, I remember where that wood came from. 40-year-old mahogany. I made sure that everything was nice and flat and planed any of the high spots using a dedicated straight edge. Always use a straight edge for this that are machined flat. Don't use a ruler because those things wobble and they can give you a false reading. So I packed up all of my Christmas shaving chips and we were ready to head over to the table saw. Another tip that I learned along the way is always square up your sliding table saw or whatever miter thing that you're going to use, whatever device, always square it up before you do your final cuts. The final trim to length was done on the table saw. Thank goodness for my sliding miter table. I would never be able to accomplish these kinds of cuts by myself without that piece of equipment. I said it time and time again, I love that thing. And I'd highly recommend it for any new woodworker that's getting into it, especially when you're working in your shop alone. Get a sliding miter table. The last step in the process, I'm just going to use a little bit of a 1/4 inch round over. I just want a very slight round over to the top of the table, just so that when you're leaning on it, it doesn't cut into your arm as you're working on it, because it is going to be used for office work, computer work, and keyboard work. And look at that. After 2 years of using my DeWalt plunge router, I finally figured out how to hook up dust collection to it. Onto this tedious sanding process, although my Festool sanders do make short order of that too. Yes, I do love sanding with the Festool sanders. So I progressed all the way from 80 to 220 grit, and I was ready to add some water to pop the grains. Very important step to pop the grains. And then sand it. I just sand it by hand with 400 grit, paying particular attention to the end grains because they need a lot of attention because those grains really pop on the end grains. The water on the rich mahogany. Oh, what a nice smell. I love the smell of rich mahogany. I need to get some mini leather-bound books. Hi, puppy. Okay, so we're ready to go now with some final refinishing. We've had it all sanded. It's all blown. It's all clean. It's all dried. It's all had its grains all popped and sanded with 400 grit, vacuumed it all off. She's all ready to go. Trying something new today. We're trying Minwax Wipe On Poly. Now, have you never used a Wipe On Poly before? It seems very straightforward. It seems very clean. It's basically apply it to a lint-free cloth and buff it in and wait for it to dry in 2 or 3 hours. Give it another coat. So here it goes. We're going to give it a coat. Well, I'm going to do one coat and then I'll fill you in and let you have a closer look. All right, I'm really liking it. It looks really nice. So you see some of the grains. Mahogany is spectacular. Okay, so here's the final product. It was actually really a simple build, not building any of the desk components, but just the top itself. Beauty thing about this system, we got this PrimeCables stand sit desk system. At the press of a button, up it goes. So it goes from the sitting position to the standing position. That's really kind of cool. We can push another button, it goes back down to the sitting position. I'll put all the links down below to all of the equipment that we had. So PrimeCables was the main supplier of the stand, the monitor system, so the dual arm system, and we got these handy dandy little lights, Icon Best Lifestyle, that mount over the monitor, and they dim and they change colors and all that kinds of fancy stuff. So really happy with the setup. And the rich mahogany top is just fabulous. I think a pretty good use for a 40-year-old project.